This is from Aeon. In the interests of all, how Eugene Debs turned American republicanism against the chiefs of capitalism and became a true crusader for freedom.
A shot rang out from the jailhouse at Woodstock, Illinois, on a quiet summer's morning in 1895. One of the inmates had pulled the trigger on an old Civil War musket after thrusting it between the iron bars of a window. The gun was fired by the Union leader Eugene V. Debs to mark the 4th of July. This was no prison break, but a demand for another kind of freedom. Later that day, he would write in praise of liberty while delivering the grim verdict that in the United States, it now lies cold, stiff, and dead. Soon to be the country's most influential socialist, how had Debs come to find himself contemplating the prospects of U.S. liberty from behind the bars of McHenry County Jail? But it must be admitted that the man himself cut a striking figure. Being possessed of great charisma, courage, and powers of speech, his French immigrant parents found their way from Alsace to Indiana, where little Jean was born in 1855. Something of the frontier spirit still survived in the small city, which had not yet suffered the sharp class divisions that were visible elsewhere in the country. Although Debs left school at 14, heading to the railroad to scrape paint and grease for 50 cents a day, his education acquainted him with the Republican history of the U.S., which held the liberty and sovereignty of its citizens in its highest regard. Graduating from the paint shop to a job as a locomotive fireman, his mother pleaded with Debs to quit the railroads after an accident killed 2 of his colleagues. An abysmal safety record and negligible compensation for injured railwaymen were just some of the ruthless business practices of crooked industrialists. Before wisely heeding his mother's warnings, Debs joined the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, subsequently rising to become his grad secretary and editing the widely read Fireman's Magazine for well over a decade. His new prominence would even lead to his election as a Democratic member of the Indiana House of Representatives in the mid-1880s. But sensing the limitations of both the state legislator and the conservative craft unionism of the Brotherhood, he sought a different vehicle to advance the interests of railroad workers.
What began to disturb Debs was the despotic power of corporations and the judicially sanctioned violence that could be unleashed on workers who resisted attempts to sack them or suppress their wages. As he later remarked, their combined influence let loose deputy marshals armed with pistols and clubs and supported by troops with gleaming bayonets and shotted guns, and has vanished liberty from the land.
He came to feel that citizens could no longer be counted as free when they were under the thumb of a plutocratic ruling class backed by a corrupt judiciary and the violence of hired Pinkerton strikebreakers, with helpless workers even coming to resemble slaves. Leading the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in the failed Burlington Railroad strike of 1888, where several workers were killed, brought home to Debs the bitter limits of this kind of organizing. So he gradually broke with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers in order to help found the American Railway Union in 1893, which aimed to unite all those who worked on the railroads, while enjoying rapid growth ahead of an early victory on the Great Northern Railroad. This set the scene for the Pullman strike that would propel Debs to national fame and put him on a collision course with the powerful economic, legal, and political elites. George Mortimer Pullman was an industrial magnate who manufactured railroad sleeper carriages from his company town of Pullman on the outskirts of Chicago. He set the rents of the houses in which his workers were required to live and imposed a strict moral code on them, including discouraging alcohol and gambling. When a nationwide financial panic hit in 1893, Pullman made dramatic cuts in wages while maintaining rents at their existing levels. Workers were squeezed dry, and they braced themselves for a desperate fight for survival. The ensuing conflict drew in the American Railway Union, which eventually called a boycott of trains that continued to carry Pullman carriages. The leaders of the American Railway Union, including Debs, did not stand down. Their fate was sealed by the Supreme Court upholding an earlier decision to jail them for contempt of court. What mostly outraged Debs and his fellow defendants was that no jury had convicted them of a crime. They had been incarcerated at an autocratic whim of a federal judge with no opportunity to plead their case in front of ordinary citizens. If Debs could be locked up so easily, he reasoned that his fellow citizens were unfree too. but the courts were not the only arbitrary authority that must be fought in order to be free. The federal government responded by obtaining an injunction to stop strikers interfering with railways, and specifically the free traffic of mail cars. The rise of industrial capitalism in the closing decade of the 19th century created a breeding ground for unaccountable power. Wage workers, in particular, were at the mercy of their wealthy employers, who determined whether they would earn enough to house, clothe, and feed themselves and their families. Without the safety net of a welfare state, the discretion to dispense the laborers effectively gave wealthy industrialists the power to impoverish workers who demanded better conditions or were simply deemed surplus to requirements. The huge fortunes of industrial millionaires also granted sweeping political influence, whether through outright bribes or more subtle webs of influence. In mounting these criticisms, Debs took himself to be following in the footsteps of a long-standing Republican tradition in the U.S., which lauded the freedom of its citizens. Yet his own path through the labor struggles of the Gilded Age would lead Debs to a more radical destination than his Republican forebears. He demanded an unequivocally socialist republic in which all could be free.
Debs turned the resonant language of Republican political thought against bosses in the whole system that sustained their power. Like Republicans of old, he warned of a fatal dependence on the arbitrary will of others, but rather than attacking the untrammeled authority of a king or overseas legislator, he adapted this analysis to the conditions of a rapidly industrializing capitalist economy. There could be no political equality when workers were dependent on capitalists who owned the resources, tools, and machines needed to make a living. Debs would conclude that no man is free in any just sense who has to rely upon the arbitrary will of another for the opportunity to work. But that unfreedom was the reality for most working people who labored and therefore lived by the permission of bosses. Control became key to how Debs understood work under capitalism. The long hours, unsafe conditions, and exhausting nature of much of this labor was not lost on him.
As a former locomotive fireman, shoveling coal into a firebox of a rail engine, Debs knew what grueling work meant. Nor did he have any illusions about the bleak conditions among the mills, factories, mines, and farms, where day after day workers slogged their guts out for a meager reward. But Debs' complaint was more fundamental than poor working conditions or even low wages. It took aim at the lack of freedom at the heart of the economy. If freedom was the destination, the solution to such vulnerability could not be nicer bosses. This conviction led Debs to a socialism that sought to secure economic freedom for all. Finding himself in another courtroom towards the end of his life, he set out this socialist demand. All things that are jointly needed and used ought to be jointly owned. That industry, the basis of our social life, instead of being the private property of a few and operated for their enrichment, ought to be the common property of all, democratically administered in the interest of all. That conclusion was not the product of the giddy enthusiasm of youth or life of detached scholarly study. It was wrestled from a tireless struggle in support of workers being chewed up and spat out by a capitalist economy and the plutocrats who had enriched.
Debs' time in McHenry County Jail was a point of inflection in the development of his political thought, confronting the combined power of industrialists, the government, and the judiciary while ending up in prison for his troubles, led Debs to think more seriously about what kind of society would allow people to be free. That his answer was socialism might surprise us. Perhaps a socialist society would be more equal, perhaps even more just, but why think it would be freer? Won't the clunking fist of the state actively deprive people of their liberty by appropriating their property and pushing them around? While freedom born of control over property remains central to this Republican story, this is no longer private property. Instead, economic freedom can result only from collective ownership. A real republic, according to Debs, cannot restrict democracy to narrowly political affairs, but must be founded on an economic democracy.
Under such a system, working life would be geared not to profit, but to human needs, nor would anything of great value be lost, since we no more need owners of the railroads and other great machines than we need a king. This was the ethos that informed the Socialist Party of America and its forerunner, the Social Democratic Party of America, which Debs helped found in 1901. He was their U.S. presidential candidate 5 times and secured 6% of the national vote in 1912. This turn to electoral politics was not only motivated by the opportunities for propaganda afforded by electoral campaigns, but the realization that political office was needed to definitively transform the country. Yet, this did not imply a rejection of the union activity to which Debs had devoted much of his life. Just as he had turned from craft unions segregated by job type to the industry-wide American Railway Union, Debs came to embrace an even more capacious model of industrial unionism that sought to bring together the whole working class. Thus, along with many of the most influential members of the U.S. labor movement, Debs contributed to the creation of the Industrial Workers of the World in 1905. They were committed to abolishing waged labor and ultimately sought to construct a new society within the shell of the old. His speeches were legendary, with working people being left in no doubt that he would always fight alongside them. But he hated demagoguery and would often stress the importance of self-education and following one's own conscience. I am no labor leader. I don't want you to follow me or anyone else. If you are looking for a Moses to lead you out of this capitalist wilderness, you will stay right where you are. I would not lead you into the promised land if I could, because if I could lead you in, someone else could lead you out. You must use your heads as well as your hands and get yourself out of your present condition.
This is a socialism from below. Fatherly leaders directing the class struggle with their superior foresight were not what was needed. The working class must instead free itself, while drawing its strength from the democratic energies of workers and citizens as a whole. The most iconic Debs quote, "While there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." It was this sincere identification with the oppressed that won Debs such a hearing throughout his political career. Indeed, he would get close to 1 million votes as presidential candidate in 1920, while still a prisoner and unable to conduct rallies or give speeches.
His victorious opponent in the contest, Warren G. Harding, eventually commuted his sentence to time served, with Debs being released on Christmas Day in 1921 after spending more than 2.5 years inside. This was not the first time Debs had been imprisoned, but this longer and more onerous stay led him to reflect at greater length on the conditions of prisoners and the place of criminality within a socialist society. The main function of law, he believed, was to keep the poor in subjection to the ruling class, and most prisoners owed their sentences to the poverty thrust upon them by the demands of a capitalist economy. In an early statement of what we would now call prison abolitionism, Debs held that prisons in anything like their current form would and should be eliminated by a socialism that stood for human liberty. Theft, in particular, would dwindle when the economic subordination created by capitalism was replaced by cooperative production and common ownership. Other crimes that remained ought to be handled by civilized institutions rather than through the brutality of prison life. Debs' often frayed health had suffered from incarceration and did not hold for long after his release. Slowed by cardiovascular problems, he died less than 5 years later at the age of 70 in 1926. But he left a vivid legacy, not only in a life that has inspired later U.S. socialists such as Bernie Sanders, but intellectual, if unscholarly, contribution to Republican and socialist thought. The promise of liberty, of free citizens not subject to the whims of bosses, judges, and plutocratic class, was not to be found in the anarchy of market competition. Instead, it required us all to have a democratic say in how the economy is governed, and the workplaces where we spend so much of our lives. That vision asks people to break with the desperate attachment to private property that has become second nature to so many of us. True security and the liberty-giving independence of thought and action that it brings rests upon a deeper act of solidarity where we learn to cooperate in our economic lives rather than dance to the tune of profit. Debs held that the path to freedom runs through the institutions of a socialist republic.